Morning, nitwits. Ah, oh, God. Oh, stretching. Oh, the blood flow. Oh. And there's Genius. Hi, Genius. Seaweeds. So, question that I'm going to be approaching with some degree of sincerity and some of just plain old humor. Should I switch my pronouns to the they, them due to the schizophrenia? I believe that perhaps schizophrenics and people with a schizotypal personality type, and my nose is crooked again. Can you see that? Looking straight at the camera. Potato nose always in the wrong place. So should I change my pronouns to the they, them, on account of the fact that I have schizophrenia? I believe schizophrenics may be the only group who can legitimately call themselves they. That and royals, of course. Royal they. Just I can imagine going to one of those vote seminars and having a Zurich voice.
No, I am hive mind. I work for the many. I have one body. I would like to get all of my thoughts into bodies and be alone. But for that, I must spread the eggs. The eggs.
Shut up about your eggs! Hello. That would be nice. That would be nice. Also, weight is down to 81.8. A few days ago, it was 82.1, so it's going down roughly at a rate of 100 grams of fat a day. Since a kilo of fat is 7,000 kilocalories, it seems that I am under eating at about a rate of 700 kilocalories a day. This has been going on for about 4 months now, and I've lost about 10-15 kilos, which is absolutely amazing. This is what happens when you get happy. You no longer eat like a dog. And I'm also going to have to go to the store relatively soon. And I will take that opportunity to visit the school I attended and get my certificates, which I have misplaced. And if they are still up to date, I will show you a list of perfect A pluses in nearly all statistics. But since these study points expire after some time, it's possible that my degree is basically empty. If it is still full, I may look at graduating from college on a professional level. Now, in Finland, high school starts a year later and extends a year more forward into what you would consider traditional college. And we don't really have colleges, we have universities. So you go from high school to university. And in this case, we are basically instructed to call it a college, but I don't really know. And I have 65 study points in the university at a grade average of 2.85, I think, on a scale of 1 to 5, which isn't high enough to immediately transfer from open university to closed. You need an average of 3, but it is pretty good. But the senior high school or college end degree that I have is phenomenal because I actually put a lot of effort into getting the classes and actually understanding what they talked about. And I had the permission to use a laptop for the writing assignments. So I wrote roughly 20 pages in the 4 hour test period every time. And the teacher said that that is an insane amount of paper that I'm producing. It's absolutely ludicrous. And if they saved all the things, which they didn't, which I consider the fault of them, one of the main reasons why I don't want to go back to that school is that they should store all your works. And when you graduate, they should give you like this much paper you have produced. Please hold on to these and then have them into a database and such. I think that should be done. So that is about the size of it. Good God. So they, them, what do you think? Opinions. And I will be listening to music and watching some fights and maybe even looking at the Norse map, though I don't know yet. And I must report that kind of like I predicted, when I'm coming down from the long-term wheat consumption, there is a demonic chaff that's trying to like interfere with me. It's nothing that I'm doing specifically, because nothing that I have discussed with people about doing is new. It's all old. But it seems that this type of demonic chaff or interference or what have you is geared towards people who are coming down from weed to give them a sense of you need this to defend yourself and so on. And that seems druggy to me. So I'm experiencing a lot more chaff, but it's not really bothersome, though a little bit of it is. And I am considering and watching how the uh, antipsychotic injection, the intramuscular that I get, how it affects this thing. Because a few times it has taken it to a bad place, and I've gotten a really bad panic attack about people observing me, which is weird because I never really care about people observing me. And a few times it has been a little hard, but overall it seems pretty mellow, pretty easy. So I will be listening to music, and I think I will be asking Norse Map, if I do get to Norse Map, about my idea of running a Second World War era uh, liberal party, if you will. I think I will call it a fascist party, because during that time, not now, but during that time, fascism was still new and we didn't realize or understand what it would be like. So if I were to go back in time to that time and run on the height of the fascism thing, it might be more acceptable than starting a liberal party. But if I were to go back to 1850s, I would definitely be a liberal party, because that was the height of the power party. I've been thinking about what I would do as Germany. This sometimes comes up for me. And I have some ideas on what I would do, like the tiered election system, giving voting rights to people of German ancestry, even if they don't live in Germany, moving all the Jews to Tunisia, which is the part of Africa directly opposite Sicily, and keeping myself out of the war because Germany really doesn't need a war during the Second World War era. If you have studied even rudimentarily your industrialization maps and who has what and how they industrialize and such, you will notice very clearly that what Germany doesn't need during the Second World War era and even the First World War era is a war. What they need is time to catch up in their production with the UK, which has a huge head start because they basically invented the steam engine and had it as a proprietary technology basically for 50 years. So when Germany finally started to industrialize, they started in the 1870s, and Britain started in the 1820s during the Victorian era's earliest points. So when the Germans went to war, they were a rising power that still had very much industrialization and development work to do at home, which is why, for example, the Autobahn network was developed so late. So Germany, if I were to come to power in 1830s, would be well positioned to industrialize until at least the 70s or 60s. Then we might look at a war, perhaps. But at that point, I believe the German work ethics would provide us with such a bundle of riches that it's not inconceivable that we would be able to purchase the Polish corridor. But no, I wouldn't go to war as Germany. It would be moronic. It would be like the US having its War of Independence in the 17th century, like 1650. It would be so moronic. You need to have a built up industry and a built up country before you can actually have a reasonable shot of succeeding in a war like that. So it's just moronic. And no, there wouldn't be death camps because you can't waste resources. That's also quite moronic. It's kind of brutal to say that it's because you can't waste resources, but but you can't waste resources. So I would probably have something like a policy of slowly exporting all the truly undesirable people because you can't be German in the 30s and like the Jews because the Jews were not liked in the 30s by anyone. They were the level of anti-Semitism we get now is child's play compared to the 30s. It's a storm in a teacup. During that time, even when it was obvious that if nobody accepts the Jews, the Germans will outright kill them, even the US said no when the Jews asked to immigrate. Get that through your mind. The US said no when the Jews from Germany asked to emigrate to the US because they knew the Germans would kill them. The French said no. The UK said no. Only people who really accepted them, and even then they didn't take in large numbers, were basically the French African colonies. That's basically it. So I would seek to purchase the area of Tunisia, which is the country most opposite the Sicilian Straits, and form Israel there in the 1930s and 40s. I would basically tell Mussolini to calm it. We're not going to go to war because we aren't interested. We will build up our military, make the Allies build up their military, so they waste resources. We will build a military that is designed to be cheap to build and cheap to man, but will have sufficient striking power to deter any allies from just walking into Germany. I would wipe my ass on the Versailles Treaty, fuck that. if you really understand what the Versailles Treaty was, you really truly wipe your ass with it. It was really unfair. But doing things like actually invading somebody, no. I might take Austria, but I don't think so. I think I would prefer Austria to reform Austria-Hungary instead of taking Austria, and I wouldn't even like to reform Austria-Hungary. I would form the European Union as quickly as humanly possible. And if you have two of your four grandparents as Germans, you are allowed to vote in the German internal elections. And that would be horrendous for the Germans. They really wouldn't like that. But the reality is that that would be the only way to tie the European nations to caring about Germany at that point, giving them voting rights. By the way, I quit smoking weed about 2 weeks ago, like I said in the previous one, and I'm feeling sick like a dog. Slowly getting better, but yeah, feeling sick like a dog. And I can only imagine how I would feel like if I'd been drinking for 10 years. I would be dead. I would be so dead. It's amazing. I'm gonna go on Norse Map, and keeping in mind that I have done some things as of late that people disagree in, and I can feel a strong desire for my authoritarian self, my right side, my right hand self, to really fuck with me. But I don't think it's real. I think it's literally my fear of authority making me uh, attack myself before they can attack me. But it may be that the countries actually loathe me, so I will see. Hello all. Okay. They're pretty much saying that while they dislike or disagree with some of my actions, it's nowhere near the level of loathing or actually seeking to do harm. They may not be desirous of protecting me from people who do me harm, but that's not really their job either. To them, they consider me one of the Japanese youth, one of the manga fans, if you will. That's what they consider me. That's what I'm getting. So, guys on Norse Map, hello. I have a Second World War timeline that I'd like to play out. I would like to see what it causes in people, what they think. I've played around with it for a few weeks now, and people on the street are more positive than I assumed they would be. So I'm going to be giving you some key points, and I'm going to be watching your reactions. And since we can't go back in time and doing an actual Axis power and the modern day in Europe is relatively impossible, you don't have to worry about me turning into an Axis overlord. That's not what I want. Well, of course you have to worry. You always have to worry about the Axis rising again because those guys really just never give up. But the idea is pretty clear. I would take roughly my political agenda with some alterations into 1933. My idea is that when Hitler campaigns and does the walk on parliament and loses and gets sent to prison, he writes the Mein Kampf. And at that point, I'm still in the Axis party, but I didn't take part in the walk on parliament because I don't think that it's a smart idea to try to overthrow the government because we don't want to get in power through that. The people would dislike it. So when he writes the Mein Kampf, I'm silent for a few weeks after it's publishing, and people ask me for my opinion, but I keep ignoring them. I keep saying no, not yet. I read it very carefully. I have actually read about 3 pages of it, and then I got physically ill at the idiocy of it. It was one of the stupidest political theses I have ever seen. It was literally moronic. But at that point, I would read the whole thing, let it sink in, let it bubble for a while, and then I would say no. I would make a case by case argument as to why it doesn't work and why it will end badly. And I would be very hostile to the Germans. In that sense, I wouldn't be hostile to the Germans, I would be hostile to the Axis, the Hitlerian agenda. And in this scenario, we have to assume that, Hitler kind of sort of dies, because if he actually rises to power in the traditional historic sense, there's very little I can do. I would probably run away from Germany to something like the US or perhaps Spain or perhaps Portugal, but I wouldn't live in Germany if they do that. Some of the key points are that they believe all the Germans should be in a German state. That's moronic, because it means that other countries who aren't initially happy to your population or don't have a large amount of your population will resist your population immigrating, because if they immigrate in large numbers, those territories that they immigrate into will be considered by Germany as rightly German. So the populations will object to having Germans because they don't want to become a part of Germany. That's one of the key points. That's why you can't have all of them in the same country. And a superpower is very inclined to have its people outside of its borders for political reasons. So when your population emigrates to other countries, you will have a say in the manner of what those other countries do. Unlike if you say that if you have a German population will annex you, in that case, they will object strongly. So the main point would be to make sure that your neighbors understand that the German population is not a threat to them. That is the main point that they have to be educated in. If they believe the German population is a threat to them, there's no way to run this thing well. They will literally oppose it to the death. Now, I would say that the best way to do that is to ensure that the population of Europe, as far and wide as possible, can vote in the German elections. This would cause the German population to literally hate me. They would loathe me for giving outsiders a chance to say in their elections, because I know how these people think, because I proposed the same thing in the modern day Axis powers of Trufin party, their forum. I suggested that we give tourists the right to vote, and I was basically told to go fuck myself, and that is not surprising to me. Now, the idea is that if you have half of your heritage as being traditional German, then you can vote in the German elections, even if you live in like France. If you have 1 out of 8, you are allowed to vote in local elections and so on and so forth, but not the national elections. And if you have half of them as German and have a history of supporting Germany and being friendly to Germany, you would automatically be a first-class citizen. There would be 3 tiers of citizenship, and the third tier, the lowest tier, could vote in local elections but not national elections. So they have a say in how their region is run, but they aren't yet entrusted with the fate of the entire German folk. If you are in the second category, which is people who have a proven like of Germany, a proven like is perhaps the wrong word, but a historical connection with Germany, that your opinion is considered sometimes to be in the benefit of the German people, and it's not just you trying to be a douche to Germany, then you would be allowed to vote in the national elections and you would automatically categorize as a second-degree citizen. If you move from a country where you have no historic connection to the German population, let's say Nigeria, then it would be assumed that if you pay your taxes and live well, you would near automatically get before you die a second degree citizenship, which means that you can still vote in the German national elections. And if you have a proven record of being very into Germany, you would have a reasonable chance, though it wouldn't be automatic, but a reasonable chance of getting first degree nationality. You would be considered national. And I can guarantee you that in the modern European stance, somebody from, let's say, Kenya moving to the European nations will not, even if they are considered by the bureaucratic system to be first class citizens as in natives, they aren't considered that by the population. There is, I hate to say this, but institutional racism. Now, the idea here is to get the people kind of interested in what happens to Germany and to be in on being Germans. And the whole Lebensraum thing, gone, not interested, because Germany at that point has more than enough Lebensraum. And in my opinion, the only reasonable place Germany can look for Lebensraum during that era is space. It's space, like now, it's space where you can look for Lebensraum. I know that that's a very unpopular idea, but that is basically the only place where we have infinite space. Earth is full, everything is built up, every nation and every province of the earth has its own population. I suppose you could say move to the Antarctica, but that's not really nice. That's not really as good as Mars, for example, or even the moon, or even the 50-kilometer altitude of Venus. That's not conductive to being alive. So the idea would be to tie the European population to Germany and tie them through that election system, get them interested in German elections, get them interested in German politics, and give them a reasonable chance of being first tier nationals within one lifetime, so that you can be guaranteed that if you are a national of Germany and have a child, the child will be considered German, so that it doesn't take you 10 generations of living in, Germany or any other country to be considered a national due to the institutional racism. That would require an immense amount of propaganda work, the likes of which, the world has never seen. But getting to the idea that the nation that's supposed to be the people, as Germany was trying to picture itself or portray itself, needs to literally accept the people. And that would be one hard task. And I expect that if I were to be the chancellor and actually propose these reforms, we would have something akin to a civil war. But I believe that may be necessary. It perhaps cannot be avoided if Germany wants to be something besides a small nation amongst small nations. And once we get these countries to be tied to Germany, we get some good trade deals and we're no longer the outcast of the First World War. The next step would be to set up what you would call Reichskommissariats in the historic language, which is, I don't even know how to translate it properly, but regions that are kind of overrun, overseen by Germany that aren't Germans. So the only way to do this in a reasonable way is to set up a guy or an office that oversees the trade with a specific region. So, for example, if in 1930s a Norwegian wants to trade with a German, they'll sail to Germany and apply in Germany for the paperwork and so on and so forth and get the permits to do the trade. But in this model, there would be a German liaison officer, I believe, in Norway, whom would do all the paperwork without having to bother the German system. And these liaison officers would be placed in a pattern that is consistent with what we'd consider their greater nations. So there would be something like the Reichskommissariat of Scandinavia, which would oversee all trade with the NBA countries, the Nordic Baltic 8 countries. And this guy would be elected by the locals. So this is a office where everybody from the local system would get to vote, even the non-Germans, specifically the non-Germans as well. And it would be to streamline the administration of the region so that you don't need to bother the German and you don't need to worry about which officer is today in charge of German trade and so on. This would be the one guy who would literally make sure that the region works well with Germany. And that would be kind of like the second most powerful man in the Reich in terms of power. He would be the guy when a Norwegian has an idea like we need to build this highway. He first applies to his government, and the government may say no. And if the government says no, he can apply to this Reichskommissariat. And if he makes a point about why this particular road system would benefit Germans and the German trade, the Germans may actually pay for it. And this would cause the other countries around us not to be such backwaters in historic terms. They would be developed along the same lines as we do. And this is as far as I think it would be reasonable to advance in terms of geopolitical power. So we would set up commissariats of Nordic Baltic 8, probably the Balkans, probably the Polish-Lithuanian region. And though in this case, Lithuania would probably belong to the NBA, but the Polish region, and probably Spain, and the rest would be on their own because they're large enough. Iberia, I think, would be the word. It would be the guy all the locals in all those countries elect that is in charge of making sure that if the locals have some trouble integrating or developing, that he would be the guy that you ask. If the locals don't have money to build a highway and you know that that highway would benefit Germany, then you ask this guy and he will build it for you. And that would be as far as I think it would be logical to go. You would need 100 years of this kind of dual enforcement of laws or dual government system for the locals to even remotely consider themselves German. So this is not a project that can be undertaken in a rush. And the idea would be to slowly and incrementally build up the European Union, to have a system where the locals have their own elections, own powers, but if things go badly, like if there's a famine or if there's something that the locals can't afford but they know that they need, you can talk to this German guy, and if his local power isn't enough, he can actually bother the chancellor, which is what the Führer was originally called. This is, damn, I'm foolish. This would be the extent of the German territorial thing. Now, if after we get like ludicrously rich as Germany, like modern day rich Germany, we might consider purchasing the Polish corridor, but I doubt that that would go through because it doesn't seem like something that would be reasonable. But if we do actually get to be super rich, then it might be something that I'd consider, but I don't think it's a good idea. I think joint administration of those regions would be as far as I'd go. It would be unreasonable to simply purchase territory. It's generally not liked. And even the largest territorial purchase in history, the selling of Alaska to the United States by the Russians, are still by a lot of Russians looked upon as a historic mistake. So it seems like a path that isn't conductive. Now, as to the question of the outsider groups that we want to get rid of, because that might happen in Germany, I don't think uh, concentration camps are a good idea. I don't think gassing anybody is a good idea because people are a what's the word? Scarce resource. Humans are a resource that is running out fast. So we can't just, exterminate people. That's not smart. And I think the only reasonable way to approach this is that if there is a group of people that don't want to live in Germany, but want their own country, which at this point would basically be the Jews and the Gypsies. In case of the Jews, I would very strongly support buying an African province from the overlords of Africa, because keep in mind that at that point, Germans didn't have any African colonies because they lost the First World War. All their colonies were taken away. So buying something like a part of Tunisia and then having all the undesirables moved there might be doable. The historic plan of buying Madagascar is idiotic because the trip to Madagascar is quite long, and Madagascar was literally a rainforest at that point. There's no point in settling like 1 million people there. And even that is a little, I mean, the historic reason the Germans persecuted the Jews has nothing to do with the fact that they hate the Jews. That is wrong. It is a wrong understanding. What they needed was one population in the group of peoples in their country that they could hate and take their stuff. The Germans actually took a lot of money from the Jews when they were exterminating them. And without the persecution campaigns, they literally didn't have enough money to fund the war. So they wanted a group that was hated by everyone, and they wanted all their stuff. They could have just as easily picked the Bavarians if they were hated, but they needed a specific group. That's why they picked on the Jews, because they had enough money that it was worthwhile, and they were hated by everyone else, and they knew that if they picked on them, nobody would come to help, because during the 1930s, the Jews were really loathed. It's child's play now how they are treated, even by the Palestinians. It is absolute child's play compared to how hated they were then. They were literally told by Hitler and the Germans that if you don't take this population when we are exporting them and telling them to leave, we will exterminate them. That is what they told the world community. And everybody, even countries like the US, were like, nah, you go ahead and exterminate them. We don't care. And that is the historic situation. In the modern day, there's perhaps the Palestinians who are treated like that, but even in Europe, they get like a reasonable chance of emigrating into Europe. And at that point, you'd have to have been like Albert Einstein to have any chance of emigrating to the US. The situation was that bad. They were beyond animals. They were considered lower than animals by almost everyone, and that is because, Christianity and killing of Jesus, but that's another discussion. So buying territory, let's say I come into power in 1933, Hitler is disgraced and retires as a painter and then shoots himself in the head, like historically. And I come into power in 1933 and I start the industrialization program. I hold a few speeches where I make clear that I'm not going to invade anybody because that's not what we do. I point to the map of carbon dioxide production worldwide and say that Britain started developing in the 1820s, and they developed pretty sufficiently until the modern age, which would be 1930. And Germany started developing in the 1870s, and they still have a long way to go before all of their provinces are at modern tech levels. Like farming, for example, used a lot of horses instead of machines. And I would make sure that people understand that until we are developed thoroughly, there's no way that we will go for Lebensraum. It's moronic. There's no way. And I would put all my effort in research into electronics, developing computers as fast as is humanly possible, and rocketry, getting into orbit as fast as possible. Now, I would do the citizenship thing, and at that point, I estimate there would be unrest in Germany for months, perhaps years. But I think that if the economic numbers support it, then the local population wouldn't be that upset about it, but they would be upset. Based on what I've read in the responses to my suggestions in the local modern access group, they would be really upset, but they wouldn't overthrow the government. They wouldn't be that upset. They would just be upset. Now, at that point, after, say, 1936, while the industry is developed and we have the Autobahn network and so on, I would say that we need the Rhineland area back and the Saarland area back and do the traditional thing that Hitler did, which is march his troops there and leave if the Allies show up, which they wouldn't at that point because the Allies also, for the most part, thought that the Versailles Treaty was moronically hard on Germany. And after that is done, we would probably have the first orbital launch in the 40s, the launch of the first orbital spacecraft, and probably the first human launch in the 50s. So we would be ahead of the technology curve on our planet by maybe 10 years. And it wouldn't be much of a head start, but it would give us a little head start over the current timeline. And once it becomes clear that people are dissatisfied, that there's groups who would rather live somewhere else, but nobody will take them, I would start negotiating with France and Italy for either Libya or Tunisia. And I believe I would take from, I think it's the Libyan city of Tripoli, I think, to the Tunisian halfway point, their capital, and there would be this block, maybe like round shape, that's half and half between the countries. And then I would say that this is now the opposing land. This is where the people who cannot live in Germany, cannot subsist in Germany and Europe, and nobody will take them, are encouraged to go. I would offer them free transport and some amount of starting aid so that you aren't literally dropped in the middle of the desert with nothing, but some amount of help so that they would actually be able to survive there. I estimate that such a province would probably be perhaps 1 million people in a decade, perhaps. If this system is done as I see in this, I don't think a lot of people would immigrate, but some people would. There would be also some Germans who would immigrate, but they wouldn't like that province because they are opposed to the idea of giving tourists voting rights, so they wouldn't want to live with tourists. So the Tunisia thing is probably that, or the Reichskommissariat idea is probably the one people would dislike the most. I mean, I can see the voting right thing going through. It would be hard for the people, but tying people who are interested in German affairs and have a German ancestry of some sort to an automatic system where they are allowed to vote in German elections would be somewhat opposed. But I think it would boost the economy to such an extent that it wouldn't be a death sentence for Germany, I think. But I can't be sure. But I am pretty sure that setting up something like a Reichskommissariat of Nordic Baltic aid for the benefit of the Germans would probably be opposed. We would see this opposition in a very low voting interest in those regions. And during that time, pre-World War II, Germany was kind of liked. It was not considered the ultimate monster of the world, but it would still not be overly friendly. It would not be overly good for the countries there. It would not be taken with cheers. It might go through, but it would not be taken with cheers. And I expect that the Allies would find some clever ways to sabotage and do their allied business towards the idea, perhaps finding their own things. And such a political game of tic tac would probably ease the transition into the European Union, which is where this should end. Because the way I see it, the European Union is basically the way for Europe to go, but not like it's done today. But the idea is good. European Union in this model would have a lot of laws that are voluntary but not mandatory. There would be treaties you can join, laws that you can join, but none of them would be mandatory. There might be something like a common security guarantee that would be mandatory, but beyond that, it would probably not be mandatory. And I don't even think we'd have one currency because that seems counterproductive. It seems limiting. Now, these would be perhaps a little opposed, but the reality is that the moment you start deporting a large number of your population to Africa, in the post-Victorian era, people would arch some eyebrows, to put it mildly. But forming what at this state amounts to Israel in the 30s in Tunisia might still fly. It might still be doable. And if they aren't oppressed in the same way in Germany that they historically were, but are given the rights to take their property with them when they leave and so on and so forth, we might see a very interesting history for Northern Africa. It might be nice to see, but perhaps not. Who is to say? When the decolonization era comes along, I think this new country of Israel in Tunisia would probably be the first to demand decolonization. It would probably be a staunch supporter of African rights, I think, based on the history being a little different and there being a few things that are a little different. But it would be a hard point. And I expect that if I were to do this, the chances are that some disgruntled German worker would just shoot me. That's the probability of what would happen. But that's roughly my platform. And that's what I would go with. And I think you can't have all the people in Germany and expect them to get along. So some people would emigrate, and for that purpose, this new country in Africa on the very coast of the Mediterranean would be very nice. And the main point of contention that I would see in this timeline is that Italy may not be convinced of the righteousness of this goal. They might be still in the process of taking their greater Mediterranean state. So it may end up with, as in a few of these simulations that I've done, with Italy, France, and Spain joining the Axis, and Germany and UK opposing them. It is possible that that is what we would see. If the Winter War comes along, it is possible that if Germany isn't the bad guy of Europe, that the Allies help Finland and end up in an open war with the Soviet Union, in which case all bets are off. The situation is so unpredictable that it's basically impossible to say what would happen next. But in such a case, if we do follow my historic stance, I would be trying hardest to stay out of the war. I would have very little interest in fighting another world war. But it is fairly likely that if Germany doesn't play the bad guy, things like the Winter War will never occur. So there would be no concentration camps, no gassing, no shit like that. And people who can't afford to emigrate into this new nation but want to leave Germany would probably have some kind of work assigned to them until they find enough money to emigrate. I think that would probably be the hardest point. And with a focus in industrial development, we would probably see a very easy path to zero unemployment. Even for people who generally don't like living in Germany, getting a job would be relatively easy. That is because the pathways into zero unemployment I have very thoroughly scanned and I know how to get to it. It's not a hard thing, but uh, it would be a trade whereby if you have a zero unemployment, everybody is a little poorer for a while, but the zero unemployment causes zero social security payments, which for almost zero, which actually saves a lot of money initially. And if you use that to pay the debts, you are pretty fine. So that would be my plan. First, get everybody who is remotely interested and has a German ancestry of some sort. This would be if it's perhaps 1 in 8 of your parents being German, of your ancestors being German, you would probably be able to vote in the local elections of German things. Like if you are a Frenchman with 1/8 parentage in Germany and you move to Bavaria, you would get to vote in the Bavarian local elections until you prove your nature, and then you would be given right to vote in the national elections. This would be to tie the population into Germany. Then after that is done, the formation of the Reichskommissariats to help the local regions develop. After that is done, the purchasing of territory in Africa from either Italy or France or both to form the dissident nation, so that the people who actually oppose us and don't want to live anywhere near us get a place where they can go, and it would be nice. I would like Tunisia and not, for example, the Holy Land, because Tunisia is, at this point in history, pretty empty and undeveloped. It's not a highly developed nation. Unlike what you would expect in the Holy Land, it is pretty sparse. And getting them a slice of that might be better than having them be nationless and considered garbage. It might be better. And the space age and computer development focuses would boost the appearance of the space technology and computer technology a little, but it would cause things like car development to lag behind. And that's about the size of it. If I do this scenario, I'm gonna find the nation that most or the population that most corresponds with this idea and do a couple of trickle events and stuff like that to get them to appear here, and I'm gonna see what it looks like. Which reminds me, I'm actually gonna do a UFC on this. This will be loud because I'm gonna listen to some music. The world nations are pretty openly saying that I know you want to call that fascism, but what you're doing in this model with Germany is not fascism. And for the sake of accuracy, we won't even bother calling it fascism. This is some form of national liberalism or national unification ideology. It's not fascism. It's not one country before all others. Giving voting rights to other nationals in fascism, let alone having voting rights. But yeah, giving voting rights to other countries or nationalities in fascism just wouldn't fly. So we won't harden this by calling it fascism. This would be some form of liberalism, something that we don't know what to call, but it is some form of liberalism. So that is pretty much what I'm hearing here. When I walk on the street, when I have this model in my mind, it is kind of what I hear. The people seem to be happier with it. They report a kind of, when I walk on the street and listen, they report a kind of freedom or sense of air, like there's more air in the world. That's what they report. And the Germans, in this case, the Finns who would be implementing this, aka the Germans, would be, what's the word? Somewhat pressured by it, perhaps. but they report that it's not a deal breaker. And the fact that air, you feel air in your lungs when you do this reform, they report is something that they might actually want to do. I have said before in Finland that I would prefer 50,000 tourists voting and getting 3 out of 200 parliamentarians to be openly in favor of the tourist population than 250,000 to 500,000 Greens pretending to be the tourist factions and basically just being watermelon communists, green on the surface, red on the inside. I would prefer that. And if you actually tie this to having to live in Germany for the elections, like you have to live in Germany for say 3 months during the elections, the amount of moolah you would make in tourism industry when the voters come in and just live there for 3 months on their own without government subsidies would be a sizable bonus. It would be a sizable bonus. In the first elections alone, if you assume that a person has to pay, say, 25 Reichsmarks or euros and a day for their living, you live in a hostel and you eat cheap food, that's 25 bucks roughly, and you have to live for 3 months, and you assume that 1 million people emigrate into Germany for the election season, which is still high. I don't think even that many would emigrate. You get 1 million times 90 times 25 Reichsmarks a year in elections. And that is, for Germany suffering from economic downfall, a pretty sizable amount of money. And that's what I'm looking at here. So I will be doing a MMA fight. This will be Chris Barnett, USA versus Shinichi Suzuba of Japan. And I believe I will pick black guy as Germany in this case, because it seems more appropriate. And the Japanese as sign of the old imperialist attitude of others are just animals. I believe this will be appropriate here. And I will be looking at both sides being authentic and not breaking the rules. And if the German guy wins, then even after all is said and done, after all these reforms are done, they would be more content with this than our current European Union standard, which is a hard question, but it is one that I would prefer to answer or find the answer to. I think the understanding that you have to live in Germany for 3 months just solved this issue. People did some math and realized that, yes, that is actually a bundle of money. And then you can limit the number of people who get to vote by simply limiting the number of hotels and hostels. That would be enough of a blockage. And if you have a lot of expensive hotels, you can get the people that vote be in the conservative expensive camp. And if you have a lot of tent villages, you can have a lot of pool voters. You have a safety valve to control this. Uh-huh. There would still be racism. It's impossible to remove, but we would be better off because Germany at that point can do a lot of propaganda. Päälle vaan. If you're a German with like voting rights and somebody attacks you, just, beat them up. From the police, fuck them up. Necessary, eat them. That was literally a no contest. He got one European on his eyebrow. as you can see, based on the comments here, a lot of people of, let's say, nationalist leanings would be very upset. One election would make 2.2 billion euros. 2.2 billion. That's in an era where the entire German military budget pre-war was around 4 or 5 billion. That's like the tourists voting, buying you your military, buying you literally doubling into your military. And if we have, if we have, it's a pretty hard topic. Uh, if we have all these people living and voting in Germany, we would still not have 1 million people living in hotels and hostels in Germany is a lot of people, and having 1 million is on the upper limits of what would be possible if we demand that they live in Germany for the duration of the election. Then that would be quite a lot. It would be a little bit of a bastardization of the idea of giving outsiders the right to vote, but it might be a workable middle ground. And I am hard pressed to turn down 2.5 billion during a time when Germany was literally fucked. Literally fucked. I mean, I understand the argument of not doing it. I understand the fact that votes are supposed to be the nation's people voting, but I would counter that if a war does occur, the people living in your country who aren't nationals are just as likely to be bombed as the rest of you. That's my counter argument. That if they choose to live in Germany, they are accepting the risk of living in Germany. They are accepting the reputation, the downsides, and so on. So it's something that I'd want to do, give tourists the right to vote, and I would be very surprised if the people would actually go for it immediately. But we are talking about Germany during the Second World War, so doing what the population may dislike is a lot more possible than in the modern era. But if we do it currently, it would be very bad. People would object to it very strongly if we do it currently. But we will see. I mean, I'm hesitant to turn down 2.5 billion. That's a bundle, like France agrees. That's a bundle. And if we do it so that we ensure that people of German nationality or the country that does it, the natives, still have voting superiority, we would end up with an interesting, what's the word, swing position for the tourists. Their opinion might be able to swing some discussions in some directions, but they wouldn't be able to do things like say that every non-German gets paid more than every German. That wouldn't happen. That would require the kind of green internal agenda, but it wouldn't be possible with tourists, I think. But who knows? Who knows? There are some other points that I wanted to make that had to do with the way I was discussing, and some of them are stuff that would be even more objected, such as the school reform. That would be a huge topic. The voting age reform, that would be a huge topic. The military having to train every German man and woman, that would be a huge topic. But those would be stuff that most Germans would kind of agree with. They wouldn't oppose them to death. But giving tourists the right to vote would be perhaps the most difficult part. I would probably call for a parliamentary session and have them debate it, with me having veto powers, but still them debating it. And it would probably not go through, but I would make a very strong case for it on why we need to integrate from the idea of Germans as a nation to the idea of Europeans as a nation. And once we get that far, the idea of the world population as a single nation. That if we take a head start in this competition and shame all the other nations into accepting that we actually have voting rights for their nationals when they aren't even giving voting rights to women and so on and so forth, we would have quite a propaganda victory. And that is something that I would be very hesitant to decline, because during that point in history, women didn't have the right to vote for the most part. And if you include women in this voting right reform, the Western nations would be very surprised when somebody suddenly says that the 20 million German descendants living in America have the right to vote in German elections if they live in Germany for 3 months during the election period. That would be a giant leap forward. I believe it would be opposed. Most people would find it, at least initially, something that they wouldn't like. But I don't I don't see it as being something where I would give up if I was the Chancellor of Germany. It's not a point that I would be willing to let go. And imagine giving uh, like 50 million Europeans and North Americans and people of German descent who have emigrated across the world the right to vote in German elections if they move to Germany for 3 months and they don't have to remain in Germany afterwards. And you get something along the lines of the entire German military budget in tourist expenses. You would be doing a lot. But it's a hard topic. It's a hard topic. This is one of those things where only the world community can solve it. When I look at this map and listen to these nations, they say that it's doable. The most opposition point that I've had here is Tunisia. They've remained quiet on this topic, but even them, I believe, might be doable. But the only way to actually know if this is doable is to have some kind of, let's say, game where the other parties are played by the people of those parties, and the German nationals get a party and the Japanese get a party, and we all game out this scenario. That would be, as far as I'm concerned, the only way to see if this actually works. It would be an interesting scenario to game out. But from what I'm seeing here, it seems like it's smart. It seems like it would be the right way to go forward. The standard liberal countries, and perhaps liberal is the wrong word, the standard child countries, just such as Portugal, are very in favor of this. They have said it out loud a few times. They are very in favor of this. It would give them the right kind of understanding of what foreigners are about. It would give them the right population to influence this situation. And it would be, I believe, worth doing. But what about you, Mr. Gwiz? Are you strongly opposed to this idea? Do you have a say? Do you want to say something about this idea? Because from my point of view, I would now be the Germans and you would now be the outside voter in my point of view. Huh, interesting. They said that in their view, this reform would take us out of the medieval era, where they didn't elaborate, but I would assume where your loyalties lie to your landlord and not to your population. They also pointed out that this is a reform coming from the fascists, and they have learned, they have adapted, and that this reform is one that is, what was the word that he used? Can't remember, but it was some good word. He described it in good terms. And the opposition is mostly in the what you might consider conservative camp, though these guys are actually conservative and are saying that this would be a good reform. They are calling it an end to medieval age.
Ah,
Yeah, they are showing what opposition looks like and what the support looks like. Oh, The angels think I wouldn't be able to control it in any way if I give foreigners the right to vote in my domestic elections. That they're pretty much saying that you know, astounding ego to think that you would be able to control them if you let them in once. But this is from, yeah. The Germans are saying it's not about money. You always get money when you sell your nation. It's not about that. They can't do it for that. But the idea of tying everybody into Germany with this method is something that they would be very keen to see. That just having everybody who is interested in Germany to have a say in Germany is something that makes the German Frau makes it the most powerful woman on the planet. That's what they are saying. And there are some voices of opposition. Other countries around Germany would be worried, to put it mildly. But the universal right to vote in this case is one that would give them. The women in the Michael Jackson video said that it would give them the right kind of respect in the eyes of the community, that it would make them have a certain elegance to it. The solution is elegant. They also say that if we do the requires that you live in Germany to be able to vote thing, we, for the first elections, might get somewhere between 3 and 5 million votes out of the 50 million Germans who can vote. So we would be talking about a party that has 10% of the parliamentary vote if they all vote for the same party. And they pretty clearly demonstrated that no, they're not going to vote for the same party. That what happens is, in the German opinion, as far as I'm concerned here, is that the Polacks would vote for Polish rights, while the French would vote for French rights, and so on and so forth. And these minor groups would be played against each other, and they would be in a conflict with one another in Germany for the rights of more rights in Germany. So it wouldn't be a unified group of immigrants voting for more rights to immigrants. It would be the French voting for the French and the Germans voting for the Germans, and so on. And it would cause some amount of instability, at least initially, but it would make Germany the true melting pot of the world. It would be the political clout, the political power that they would get is unparalleled. That the discussion revolves around what would happen to the German woman and what would happen to German political power. And they say that it would be good for them. It would be good on both accounts. the wolfhound said pretty clearly that if he was given rights to vote like that in Germany, he would eat anybody who even slightly harms Germany. It would be the place. He would be nationalist, beyond nationalist. He would be so proud of his country or the country for doing this that were somebody to even breathe hostile to them, they would be ultra nationalists. That's what the German wolfhound is saying. And in this case, I believe the wolfhound may have been French. American, I think, is French American. Quebecian, perhaps. So I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to leave it here and let you guys debate. Being a small-time politician, I can't really enforce any of these things, but I can encourage debate, being a small-time person. So I hope this debate causes some new ideas, but I may return to this topic relatively soon, but I have other things to do now. Thank you for participating. So that's it for this one. I found some interesting truth in this, and I hope they will mature well. So yes, thank you for participating.